Hi, welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be here today introducing the closing keynote and dialogue with Adriana Cavarero and Nidesh Lawtoo. Adriana Cavarero is a philosopher, a feminist, and a political theorist. She is professor of political philosophy at the University of Verona and has been a visiting professor at various universities, including the University of California, New York University, and Harvard. She is the author of numerous books, including In Spite of Plato, Stately Bodies, For More Than One Voice, Heroism, Inclinations, and Surging Democracy. Nidesh Lawtoo is an assistant professor of philosophy and English at KU Leuven and principal investigator of the European Research Council project, Homo Mimeticus, and the C1 project, Gendered Mimesis. He is editor of Conrad's Heart of Darkness in Contemporary Thought, author of Phantom of the Ego, Conrad's Shadow, Fascism, Contagion, Community and Myth, and Coming Up, Violence and the Unconscious. Please go ahead, Professor Cavarero and Professor Lawtoo. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Willow, for this kind introduction. And thank you very much, Adriana, for really being with us for this marathon that feels like a two-day marathon on mimetic inclinations. You've been so very generous, and it has been really a pleasure and an honor to have you with us and to see the spectrum of different inclinations, mimetic inclinations that open up subjectivity, well, to newborns and to marginalized categories, but also pushing it very far to non-human forms of life as well. And so for today, I thought it would be good to wrap it up, to continue a dialogue that we have had for quite some time. We started, I think, 3-4 years ago. And since a dialogue is an oral form, and we are both interested in Plato, so of course we are attentive to that. It's an oral form, there are voices, there are bodies. Dialogues take place in specific contexts, and the setting is not just background, but actually informs the thinking. I thought I'd briefly frame our dialogue, and how this dialogue on mimetic inclination started with a story. And stories are, of course, very important. And I'll share my PowerPoint so I don't take up too much time, and I'll try to be as effective as I can. And the story starts in New York, which is a city that Adriana likes very much, specifically Manhattan. And we had met there for a conference on Joseph Conrad. I think it was in 2017. And so it was also a dark time to be in the US in general, and in New York in particular. And so we naturally gravitated both towards this text that we both love, which is Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And it's a text that shows that, of course, the darkness is not at the heart of Africa, but it's all around. And we felt the shadow of Heart of Darkness in New York when we were present. And so we gave a talk, both of us, and we both addressed the power of holo leaders, with the power to cast a spell or magnetize the masses. And that's how Conrad defines Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. And Adriana spoke of the soundscape of darkness. And so paying attention to sound and voices and the power of voices. And then after we finished the talk, we were fed up, and we wanted to get some fresh air and went for a walk. And that's something that we would like to do at a conference, to say, okay, let's go out and let's walk a little bit. And it was a rather long walk. I traced it with Google Maps, so you can see it here. It's almost 2 miles, a 40-minute walk. So Adriana has this energy, so she kept walking. And as we walked, well, we passed by, we were at Fordham University, and we passed by this tower. And so we looked up, and it was one of Trump's hotel, of course, which is right there at the corner of Central Park, east, south. And so this shadow of a vertical structure, we literally saw it and felt it. And we could not help but think about the power of vertical leaders, phallocentric leaders, with this power to magnetize the masses, not only at the heart of Africa, but at the heart of Western civilization, with quotation marks. But luckily, then we were close to Central Park. And so we continued the walk through Central Park. And at the time, I was wondering, why do we keep walking? Because as you know, if you've ever been in Manhattan, many of you have, of course, it is exhausting to walk. But in Central Park, there was a different atmosphere, different sounds, joggers and children playing, and some fresh air, which is also something that we talked about in this conference. But Adriana kept walking, and the reason that she kept walking is because she wanted to reach Grand Central Station in New York, so 2 miles away from Fordham, where we had started. And so she invited me for a coffee. I think it was the most expensive coffee of my life, on that beautiful terrace overseeing Grand Central and seeing these people going and catching their trains. And at some point, she tells me, ascolta, listen. And so I listened, and there was this buzzing noise and vibration, and I heard it. And then she told me, questa è la voce della pluralità. This is the voice of plurality. And I tell this story, this setting, because in many ways it encapsulates our dialogues that we have had over the years on mimetic inclinations, or shared concerns with the shadow of authoritarian leaders that cast a spell on the masses on the one hand, and yet at the same time, the surging potential of unique voices that are constitutive of the voice of plurality, as Adriana Cavarero calls it. And these 2 books that appeared together in 2019, in a way, bear the traces of that walk. And I mentioned that Surging Democracy book. If you haven't read it yet, it's available in English. So pick it up as soon as you have the occasion. I just wanted to give you that setting, because in many ways, I want to situate the conversation today. Would it be in Leuven? We would have gone for a walk in the afternoon and headed outside. In Central Park as an imaginary effort. Let's imagine that we are in Central Park, in a space that is, of course, designed for humans, but was there well before the humans. What always strikes me about Central Park are those rocks that are there kind of underneath, sustaining than the human skyscrapers and constructions, and the non-human life that is there, that is vital for human happiness and relations and encounters. And so I would say, let's imagine that we are in Central Park, between the voice of the masses and the voice of plurality, in a space that is open to the non-human as well. And this is basically, for me, an occasion to allow Adriana to speak and to respond to any of the points that emerged during the brilliant 2-day conference. Of course, you won't be able to address all of it. It's not possible. We have a time frame. But this is the setting, and I consider myself a medium, just a link in a chain to allow for these voices, unique voices, to circulate in a positive contagion. Positive form of contagion that Adriana spoke about. So I'll stop sharing the screen. And so maybe, Adriana, thanks again for your generosity. A first question that I have resumes what we started discussing during the introduction, your interest in a notion of mimesis that is not only linked to vision and a stabilizing mirror, that it's somehow speculative, that it's reassuring in many ways, but you spoke about your interest in paying attention to this second notion of mimesis that has to do with sympatheia, with a shared pathos. And pathos is a difficult word to translate. It's linked to pentos, to sorrow, but not necessarily only tragic emotions. It's a force that takes possession of the ego and dispossesses it, I think, as you say, for good and ill. And what I'd like you to talk a little bit more, if you feel like it, is why do you think this pathos is so important to account for your notion of mimetic inclinations or inclinations? And I ask the question because you always, return to Hannah Arendt as one of your main sources of inspirations. And there are so many continuities between your thought and Hannah Arendt on unicity, uniqueness, and plurality, and relationality and birth. But at the same time, there seems to be something distinctive in your voice. You have a very acute speculative ear. Yeah, I think that's a phrase that you use. And when I read you, I also hear differences in your attention to pathos. I think you mentioned at some point in the video that I will show later that Hannah Arendt is not the best person to think about the phenomenology of emotions. But you go there with Arendt, pushing Arendt in that direction. So could you talk a little bit more about your specific interest in mimetic pathos that goes beyond Arendt in relationship to maternity or any other aspects that you find relevant?
Yeah, I remember very well this coffee in Central Station, and it was before the pandemic. And regarding your question, I think that mimesis, or if you want, mimetic inclination, is a good way to approach the question of togetherness. It was mentioned this afternoon, togetherness. Let's use this word. And traditionally, politics has been thought in terms of power, the traditional notion of power, not the Arendtian one, and of government, of taking power and governing people, disciplining people. And this it is a strange mistake. And I learned from Arendt to think of politics in terms of togetherness. A togetherness which is not the same of other ways of being together, because we could be together if we are friends, if we are lovers, if we walk together, have a walk together. It is a special form of togetherness, a political form of togetherness, in which we experience a peculiar emotion that Hannah Arendt calls, of course, public happiness. And my not different approach, but the different perspective, different way of crossing this issue of togetherness as a public happiness enjoyed by plurality focuses on the voice instead of only visibility. Arendt, I think she is very Greek, ancient Greek, because she focuses almost on visibility. The public is something under the light that we can see each other, and we are in a way elevated, and we feel a sort of glorious happiness to be together and to appeal to each other. All this Greek vocabulary of visibility. I think that it is interesting to try to focus on the same problem, the same issue, by using topic of voice, because voice is very emotional. And this is why, as you know, Plato was so afraid of voice, of poetry, of epic, of singing, because it's something which is absolutely linked to the bodily constitution of human being, something that we share with many animals, many non-human animals, and something that expresses emotions. So it is very interesting, and I have a question for you. That, in my opinion, by focusing on the voice, we can, this is what I try to do, we can distinguish different forms of togetherness. The fusional togetherness of the crowd, of the mass, in which we have the populist leader, the masculine sovereign populist leader, which is very dangerous, and in which the human condition of uniqueness is fused down, merged together in order to construct huge, impersonal, supra-personal subject whose voice is a voice at the unison, which is just the contrary of plurality. On the other hand, the emotion, the vocal emotion of plurality is very difficult to describe, because you know that it is very easy to describe something dealing with the visual field. It is more difficult to describe something dealing with the phonetic field, with the aural field. It is not visible, only audible. But it is interesting to speak, to try to analyze this specific emotion. I'd say, I call it a democratic emotion, the emotion of being together, the emotion of participating without losing your embodied uniqueness. And something in which, and this is a question for you, if there is a mimesis, it is not a fusional mimesis, but a mimesis which underline or expresses the joy of togetherness, preserving uniqueness. And if we could speak of a politics whose fundamental concept is togetherness, we could speak also of political emotions without running the risk of going down and being caught in the neo-fascist or fascist tradition, the tradition of the conglomerate of uniqueness in a togetherness which is not a togetherness, but which is a fusion waiting for, I'm quoting Arendt, waiting for a leader. And on the one hand, if we speak of togetherness as a relationship of a plurality of unique beings with the emotion of public joy, in this hand, we are speaking of horizontality. We are not looking for a leader. Could be a leader, would be necessary for the institutional transformation of this democratic emotion. But the leader is not there. The very beginning of democracy is horizontality, plurality in horizontality. In the other case, the case of the crowds, of the masses, the leader is already there, because the leader is the real, the consequent voice of being solidificated, amalgamated in one subject.
Thanks very much. And indeed, this is a part of that conversation that we keep returning to, and it's one that I think it's fundamental and important, and that's why I situated the dialogue in space, because it's easier to see. There is the verticality of the Trump Tower with all it stands for symbolically, and then there is the more horizontal space of a station in which people assemble without fusing, and I think it's very useful to set up this distinction. I don't have your ear. I think your ear is unique in the way you listen to texts, but I do share that attention to different forms of affects that can constitute different forms of being together. So for instance, in the Phantom of the Ego book, I ended with a community that is held together by laughter, and a laughter that is not a laughter of exclusion, of scapegoating, but an inclusive, horizontal laughter. And I find this distinction between verticality and horizontality very useful. And my fear, as you know, is this situation in between in Central Park is the fear that one form of plurality can always potentially turn into a mass, and that there might be diversity into the mass. Or uniqueness into the mass that we risk overriding. But this is, a distinction that I think is very important to ground what you call responsibility, right? Your resistance to fragmentation and fusion stems from an ethical concern, which is also a political one. And so maybe I throw you back a different question. Can you imagine a form of responsibility that is based on uniqueness, but since this uniqueness is inherently relational and open to the outside, the uniqueness is the ideal. And that what I feel when I'm part of a group, and even what you call a plurality, is a change in my body response to the outside, and a certain transformation, physiological transformation that has to do once again with this pathos that connects without fusing. So can you think of responsibility that relies as much on a unique subject with a who, which is distinct, but at the same time is also in an horizontal relation of affective communication that problematizes that uniqueness, that renders it fluid, to use a metaphor that was used before in relation to birth?
Yeah, you saw a central problem in my position. I think it's a general problem, but in my position, it is a problem. And it is a problem of the transition from ethics to politics. I think Levinas has the same problem, a very serious problem in Levinas, because it is easy, or anyway, it is not difficult to speak of responsibility on the level of ethics. You respond to the other. The other, or as Levinas would say, the face of the other is a unique face. He or she is a unique human being, and I'm responsible of you because I must respond to you. Because ethics, according to Levinas, I agree with him, he is very intelligent in this intuition. Ethics is not rooted in the I, or in the I, in the ego, you say the ego, but ethics, radical ethics, is rooted in the presence, in the face of the other, the uniqueness of the other. So the first praxis, the first gesture of ethics is to respond to the other, to respond of the other, and to preserve the other in his, her uniqueness. And if we turn this discourse into the field of politics, it is more problematic, because as you said, but also in the discussion of this conference was mentioned, plurality is not something static. Plurality is fluid, is a reticular togetherness in which you are in proximity with other people, but people change in this web of proximity. So there is this fluidity. To be responsible, this is what I suggest, to be responsible is to respond of the status of fluidity and dynamic situation of this plurality. I mean, to respond of what is fundamental for being ontologically a plurality. If you cancel the uniqueness of others, you risk turning plurality into a crowd, into a monolith subject. So it is true, as I said before, that we enjoy a natural, a spontaneous emotion in participating in politics as the interacting of a plurality. But this emotion is not enough. You have to preserve this emotion. You have to let this emotion open for the future. Maybe not for your future, but for the future of others. So you respond of this. You are responsible, which doesn't resolve the problem, because the real problem, the further problem, is the fact that you have to think of institutions that are able to let you to be responsible. If you think that you consign your responsibility to institution, you are outside democracy, according to my interpretation of art. So it is important to think of the construction of institutions that preserve this horizontal responsibility, and so preserve the possibility of participating joy of public happiness. It is a very difficult problem. It is easy to speak about that, but very, very difficult to construct that, especially in a global scenario. This is why many years ago, by quoting Arendt, I spoke of the absolute local. In my opinion, there is the quality of politics, if we intend for politics plurality together and uniqueness and so on. No, the quality of politics, in my opinion, is linked to locality, to a territory, to people who are present. It is just the contrary of the fantasy of a global government, no, the government upon all the world. Think, for example, of the banalization of the neoliberal notion of economy and market, something that functions everywhere, which is globally effective. I think that when we think globally, we are wrong. We are wrong politically if we want to preserve the responsibility of democracy. We have to think of democracy locally. And locally is another problem. Of course, I'm not going to go on forever, because you have many absolute local, and you have the relationship between the absolute local. And so it is very difficult, but we have to do this effort of thinking in these terms.
Yes, indeed, and new work, Social Democracy, does it by starting, I mean, what I find admirable is that it engages with the emotion of happiness in this utopic, revolutionary way, which I think is important for the future, as you say. But so maybe that leads to another question, which has to do with inclinations and the postural geometry that you suggest. And it's a naive question. Someone who might encounter your work for the first time might sense a tension on the one hand between the abstract figures of geometry, which is a very precise science, and the uniqueness of the works of art and the voices that you're attentive to. And you spoke yesterday already about Foucault, the importance of Foucault to think about a certain system of verticalization in discursive forms of power. I was wondering if you insist on, I understand the need of providing an alternative to Homo erectus, right? I was wondering if Plato, since you devote a chapter to Plato, is also part of the picture, because Plato was obviously also interested in geometry. And I was wondering if there is a form of mimetic agonism in your confrontation with Plato, a little bit like when Plato is confronting Homer, he's not simply opposing Homer, he's also stealing from Homer, adopting some of the techniques in order to better oppose him. I was wondering if the idea of taking geometry is part of this agonistic confrontation with Plato, which then, you totally destabilize by throwing in paintings and narrative and all the mimetic simulations that Plato feared.
Oh yes, I have a mimetic inclination for Plato. I have a mimetic admiration for Plato. And so, of course, I appreciate very much the distinction that Plato does between geometry and philosophy by putting geometry as the last step in order to learn philosophy. So he has a positive idea of geometry, a positive idea of episteme, of science. And when I deal with the geometry as a postural geometry, a postural disposition, I was thinking with Foucault, not only Foucault, but Foucault was very important for me, of the fact that there is a science that we call geometry, a science exact, a science universal in this way. But we are dealing in history with applied geometry, applied science of geometry. Think, for example, of a city, of the map of a city. We have this applied geometry, and what struck me is that applied geometry is not only a question of constructing a urban world, urban figure, or constructing buildings like in architecture, but also constructing relationship, form of dependencies. And you cannot imagine dependency if you put your imaginary on the vertical axis. If you put the vertical axis, there is no dependency. I mean, there is dependency in the form of hierarchy or in the form of the leader, the image you show at the beginning, like a leader incumbing, on the population, or the famous cover of the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. But if you think of reciprocal dependencies, or even better, of embarrassed dependency, of a web of dependency, you have to think not in terms of verticality, but of inclination. So this is a way of giving a human body to geometry. When you accept it, Geometry is abstract as a definition, according to Plato. Geometry deals with ideas because it is universal, abstract, divisible to the mind. And if you apply geometry, or if you interpret in terms of geometry the human condition, you have an applied geometry in terms of human bodies. We were speaking of squares crowded with people, or central station crowded with people. But to be more precise, they are crowded by bodies. And the body has a geometrical postures, different geometrical postures. And now it is late, I'm tired, but think of the role in the development of Western culture for the dancing. Dancing is a geometry, a living geometry. And I think that the emotion of dancing, of the pleasure of constructing figures with the body, with the rhythm of the bodies, is sort of universal emotion. Different, because if we want to be concrete, we have to be local. It's especially local, and local for the time, I mean, historically local. But there is something universal, could be the human body, I mean, the postural fluidity or capacity of having different posture of the human body, which can be resumed in the pleasure of dancing, the pleasure of dancing. Of course, I'm not an expert, but it's very similar to the pleasure of hearing and the pleasure of a plural landscape, soundscape.
Absolutely, and that's how also the theory of mimesis originates, as you know very well, in dance and ritual. So it brings us back to, I wanna conclude my part, because I know other people have questions, but maybe just one last question has to do with the human, right, and the non-human. Because at the very beginning, we had papers that pushed the inclinations towards non-human form of life, including air and lichens. It has to do with the work that you are developing now on hyper-maternity. And I was wondering where you're taking it, how far you're willing to incline the subject, and what are the stakes of the concept of hyper-maternity?
I'm just trying to think of our relationship with the world, I mean, and in my opinion, it is important to think of our relationship, of the human animal with the non-human animal and with the environment. I think that we risk, not we philosopher, but the discussion, today's discussion on the question of environment, of the crisis, we risk jumping from the human condition to the condition of the earth. But there are graduation in our relationship with the world. And we have to think about our being human animal in touch inside ourselves of not human animal. I mean, what we share as human animals and not human animal is the direct experience of life as a process. And I think that we cannot do serious discourse on the environment without taking account seriously of that. Of course, all the people admit that we are a human animal, but this is not enough to admit that. It's to think of ourselves as human animals, let's say, responsible of being part of a greater expressions of life, a multiple expression of life. I think the topic of maternity is interesting in this sense because through birth and through the experience of giving birth or experience of pregnancy, it is the case in which a human being, a singular bodily human being, experiences in her own body the presence of the process of life. And I will approach this at the moment, I'm approaching this not from an ethical point of view, but from an ontological point of view, ontological first. And I know where I'm going, but this is my beginning, my very beginning.
Well, we are delighted to hear it, search, and look forward to reading it. So I think I thank you very much, Adriana. Now, I would like to pass the word to some of my team members. Willow Verkek has a question that might resonate and follow up. Willow, I'll let you ask the next question.
Thank you, Professor Cavarero. Many of your points during your discussion, your dialogue, thank you, Nidesh, also have answered a lot of my questions, actually. But one question that I wanted to ask you, Adriana, has to do with the Homo erectus. And in Inclinations, you provide a robust critique of the Homo erectus, which is so helpful for analyzing the androcentric subject of modern European philosophy. But I was wondering if you could now speak a little bit to what you see are really some of the ethical, political, or ontological consequences of the Homo erectus, the anti-mimetic Homo erectus. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I think that for answering, I would reconstruct all of the history of philosophy and also all of the history, at least of the Western tradition. I always speak of the Western tradition because it's the only one I know. It's not universal. It's my perspective. Something I study is the Western tradition, something I know. And I think that, but I also have wrote about that, but my short answer is that the Homo erectus, the sovereign subject, is a belligerent subject, is a violent subject. Because the very beginning of the picture is isolation. Isolation. You can have many vertical subjects, but they are individualist, isolated. And I think it is difficult to speak of peace, of not violence, beginning the discourse from the picture of the vertical subject. So I think that our fight, so to say, for dismantling the vertical subject is a fight for not violence, for construction, for an imaginary of not violence. And this is where I meet Judith Butler's discourse, and I agree with her. I mean, we have similar aims, maybe we have different way of reaching the goals, but this is where we resound with one another.
Thank you so much. I would pass over to Isabelle. I think Isabelle wanted to ask a question. Isabelle Dahms.
Hi, many thanks. Actually, yeah, I've changed my question slightly because I was interested and you emphasized throughout the importance of the given. And I was kind of curious if you could say a little bit more and I was wondering, how does history or social historical context fit into your understanding of the given? Is there already something continuous, performative, or mimetic within the given?
Yeah, the given is one point that Hannah Arendt mentions in The Life of the Mind, and which in Latin we could mention as data or factum is the same, is given. It's something that you don't construct, it's something that you don't decide, it's something you are not in control of, and which is part of the condition of the human animal. You are not in control of your animal life, of your, and you can dream or rationality in control of itself. You can dream of it. Of course, it is not true, but you can dream of it. It makes sense. But you cannot dream of being in control of who you are and your bodily consistence. You cannot dream of controlling it. So this is a given. And in my opinion, the fact, for example, of maternity, I mean, the fact of being born by a mother is given. So this is what you have to make sense of. And this operation of making sense of is going on and on and on. You cannot give the definitive sense. There is no definitive sense. This is our effort of giving sense, of signifying, this is the correct word, of signifying the given. But the operation of signifying is repetitive, is going on and on. And this is why history and also philosophy, or the history of thought, or the history of the social history, the history of society, the history of politics, is a question of passing from generation to generation. Because there is no generation that gives the definite significance, the definite sense to what is given. What is given and the signification of the given is passed, transmit to the next generation. And this is history, in my opinion, human history.
Many thanks. Giulia, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, actually it fits very well to the conclusion of your Isabelle's and your answer, Professor Cavarero, because it was linked back to Rosi Braidotti's definition of your methodology of theft as a strategy of mimetic repetition. And since I won't stop to think of this mimetic inclination, since it concerns my PhD dissertation, I would like to ask you if you could say something more about that and about this, what kind of mimesis you see at play in this temporality. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, but maybe Nidesh could conclude on this issue. I think that there is no way of escaping mimetic repetition. There is no way. We are mimetic animals. There is no way. But on the other hand, this is not static. This is dynamic. There is an evolution. There is a past, a present, and a future. And there is change in repetition. If it weren't a change in repetition, we weren't human. We weren't human anymore. What is peculiar to the human animal is to be a mimetic animal given, driven to repetition, but inserting a change in the process of repeating. And this is what we call culture. or what we call language. So in my opinion, your research, if you want an advice from an old philosopher, your research has to find the connection, the equilibrium between the repetition and the insertion of change in the process of repetition. For justifying language, culture, art, how could you have art? Art is mimetic for definition, but how could you have art if art were only mimesis and repetition? And this is something that Plato understood, but something that for him was very disquieting, because it dealt with divenire, with the becoming, and he was not so fond of becoming. He was fond of static object, but repetition is interconnected with becoming. So how can you have a mimetic repetition, come si dice, che si sfoga, going toward an perennial becoming? And this culture.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I don't have, much to add to your wise words. I fundamentally agree. I think that
Yes.
it's wonderful advice. Maybe just, somebody like you who engaged with the tradition of Western philosophy. What I think it's powerful in thinkers who take on the weight of a tradition is that in the process of repetition, the power of innovation is almost stronger when there is that genealogical connection that you are talking about.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. I agree. The weight of the past, the weight of the culture is very heavy on us. And this is why I'm very happy to have been in this conference where I saw very young scholars, very innovative, very enthusiastic. And this is why repetition is not going to be our death, but our becoming. This is my hope.
Absolutely, that's indeed the hope. I invite everybody to switch on their screen so that we see a plurality of faces, which is very important, which we have been.
Yes, I could.
You've been incredibly generous. I mean, we could not have hoped for more participation. You've been present from the beginning to the end, feeding us thought and inspiration. You're certainly in touch with the power of the muses. And so that voice speaks to many of us. Once again, thank everybody on behalf of the Gendered Mimesis team for this wonderful conference, this wonderful enthusiasm and new life that you brought to this concept of mimetic inclinations. We spoke of an hypothesis, and I think you've taken this hypothesis of joining mimesis and inclination in so many productive directions. That is part of what we call the mimetic turn. You're part of it. It is a collective effort, but each voice is unique. What was striking is that there was no repetition of the same in any of the papers. You each add an individual perspective. But for the moment, I would simply like to join everybody and thank Adriana Cavarero for giving us inspiration and so much food for thought.